they need to see us doing it first and then us do it with them. And then they're going to go out and do it on their own. So to any parent that's like, oh, that sounds really great, I'll send them to UPW, or I'll send them to this thing. Time out. Let's take a look in the mirror first and say, hey, where do they need to see me showing up? Because they're too busy watching us. They don't want to hear what we have to say.
Here's what I want to start is I'm a 7-time firewalker with Tony Robbins. And when I read in your book that you had a 13-year-old and a 14-year-old, and I read the story of like the crew took one of your daughters and behind the scenes to kind of work with her a little bit. And I was like, we're best friends. I haven't even met you yet, but like I was fired up about that. And I just want to hear from your lens, just digging right in to how did you get introduced to Tony? How did you get to introduce to the Firewalk? Why was it something that you're like, all right, I got to have my daughters do this in their early teens, early adolescence, because that is abnormal for that community. And for a parent to say, yeah, let's have my kid walk across burning hot coals. It's like 1400 degrees. I want to start there just to give us a little context, because that was awesome when I read that.
Oh my gosh, I love it. I had no idea we were going here first, and I love it. So my first introduction to Tony was actually when I was in high school, and my mom would fall asleep watching the infomercials. And it was back when Tony would dress in the suits, and he looked so uncomfortable. And you're like, who is this guy talking about unlimited power or whatever he was talking about then? And she bought like the tapes. And so she would have all these tapes, and I actually don't remember listening to them, but I remember listening to the infomercials. I'm like, that's kind of interesting. I kind of socked it away, didn't think much of it. And I remember when Seth and I got married, he was working an internship get this, an assistant manager at Walgreens. And I think it was an internship in college or something. And somebody burned him a copy of Jim Rohn CDs. And he would start listening to these Jim Rohn CDs. So that's kind of how we got into this personal growth world. Nice. And so fast forward, we get into real estate. Tony Robbins comes back again. We're like, I'm like, this is the same dude from the infomercials. And so Seth went first to a UPW, Unleash the Power Within event. He's like, Alyce, this is really amazing. You need to go. He took me, I did the Firewalk, and we're like, oh my gosh, this is really amazing. Like, how do we introduce our kids to this? And so we started talking about it as a family, and our 14-year-old, we're like, would you want to go? She was a freshman at high school at the time. We're like, would you want to go? And she's like, yeah. And everybody says yeah until they get there the first day and they realize like, oh, you do it on the first day, not the fourth. Because everybody thinks like, oh, like you work your way up to it. But the reality is you get it out of the way right at the beginning. And the theory that Seth and I have behind it was, if you can be that age and walk on fire, what possibly could you not do the rest of your life? So we wanted to cut through a bunch of limiting beliefs early, because we spend a lot of time right now rewiring our brains from all this stuff from when we were kids. And what if we just wired them the right way from the get-go instead of having to rewire it later, because they just don't have as much baggage. So she did it at 14. The second daughter did it at 13. Third daughter did it, I think, at 12, or she was still younger than the other one because she's got like bragging rights. And then the fourth one is 10 and she's waiting. She's like, when's my turn?
Before I get Biggs, I could kick it to you, but I just want to say I absolutely love that because, 14, the 14-year-old is now 18, right?
Yeah, she just turned 19. Yep.
So 19. So I mean, this is, a few years removed now. And that's where my curiosity stemmed, which is like, and maybe you go through it in the book, but I'm like, wow, she walked across fire at 14. I did my first Firewalk when I was in my like late 20s. And to your point, a lot of that trauma that I was walking across the fire was from like my 14-year-old self, and like that chapter of life. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is a perfect opportunity for me to get into the mind of the mom who, sent the 14-year-old kid who now has a 19-year-old, like what foundation was laid there? Like, is there something that you've noticed as that being foundational? Was it like not that foundational? Because I'm sure there's tons of stacking and like what the symbolic reference of that is. Because I have it on my dreams list to take my son on a Firewalk when he's in like his teens. So.
And I'll give you this one caveat. I'm always careful to say, like, when we talk about Firewalks and all these things that our kids have done, the one rule that Seth and I've like put in place between the two of us is that we're not going to send our kids to do something that we haven't done first. We're going to model it, right? Because this isn't about fixing them or, you know, hey, you just go be better. It's they need to see us doing it first and then us do it with them. And then they're going to go out and do it on their own. So to any parent that's like, oh, well, oh, that sounds really great. I'll send them to UPW or I'll send them to this thing. You know, time out. Let's take a look in the mirror first and say, hey, where do we, you know, where do I as mom, where do they need to see me showing up? Because they're too busy watching us. They don't want to hear what we have to say.
That's awesome. I mean, it's super inspiring. And I love the idea of, wouldn't it be great if we just didn't mess our kids up as much as we got messed up and then we don't have as much work to do later? And I'm sure that the Magic Mom, book highlights a lot of these things. I'm curious, what kind of, go back to the origins of this book. Like what inspired you to want to write this, to try to, spread the word that you are up to? What would you say there?
So back in 2002 or so, we were lucky enough to see Jim Rohn speak live, one of his last live events before he passed. And he had us do these bucket list exercises. And one of the things that would constantly show up on my bucket list was, well, I want to write a book. I had no idea what I wanted to write a book on, but I knew that I wanted to become the kind of person that would have something to write about. And so I, socked it away and I was like, oh, I don't know what I'll write about. I don't know what I'll write about. And, fast forward to year, 15, 16 of selling real estate, I'm starting to feel burned out. And so I create some margin in my life of, okay, what's next? What do I want to, what am I here for? What's my purpose? What's the bigger, what's Alyce Dailey about in a bigger sort of way? Because I knew there was something next. I just didn't know what it was. And so I would, whenever you feel stuck, we feel stuck because we're either not growing or we're not in motion. So I'm like, okay, what does that look like to be in motion? Listen to podcasts, read some books, have more conversations with people. And it was through that process that I started to dig into the question of, Alyce, what is the one question that people ask you so many times that you don't even think about it because it's just a natural response that you give, that it's so subconscious. You're in this unconscious competence in it. You don't even know that it's happening. And I was like, oh, well, that's easy. Because every time I go teach, speak, travel, the question that we get asked is, how did you raise 4 daughters that are so curious and kind and adventurous and entrepreneurial in nature? Like, oh, I could talk about that all day long. So why don't I write about that? And so that's where the book was actually born, was out of answering the question that I got asked the most. And that's the question I would pose to the listeners today is, what do people ask you so often? They just come to you for the answer, but it's so unconscious that you don't even know that you're spitting out an answer. Because that's where, for all of us, I think that's where our genius lies.
And I want to make sure I double click on this, because you said entrepreneurial in nature. And I love the way you described that in the book, where you said entrepreneurial is simply taking initiatives and taking risks, or having initiatives, taking risks. And I like that you kind of describe it that way, because many people, when they hear entrepreneurial, they're like starting a business, lemonade stand for a kid or something like that. But you're like, let's really break it down what it means. It's like having initiative, taking risks. That doesn't have to necessarily only be business.